Woman lost her place in a billion-pound family before she ever met them, because of something her great-grandfather did decades before she was born. Nobody told her the real reason. She was simply told the match wasn't right. But inside that family, in a room she never entered, a single line in a private ledger had already decided her fate. And once you understand what was written in that line, you'll never look at a wealthy wedding the same way again, because the rich don't choose who they marry the way the rest of them. And the real reason is stranger, older, and colder than anyone expects. It has nothing to do with romance, almost nothing to do with attraction. And it started long before either of the two people involved were even born. By the end of this, you'll understand why some of the most admired families on earth turned down partners who were richer, more beautiful, and more accomplished than the ones they finally accepted, and why the ledger that rejected her was, in its own cold way, doing exactly what it was designed to do. The door everyone assumes is open. Ask most people why the rich marry the rich, and they'll give you the same lazy answer. Proximity. Same schools, same parties, same zip codes. Of course they end up together, who else would they meet? That explanation feels true. It's also almost worthless. It tells you who the wealthy bump into. It says nothing about who they're allowed to keep, because here's the part nobody mentioned. Inside old money family, falling in love is the easy part. Getting approved is the war. And the strange thing is, the more money a family has, the smaller that war makes the battle. You'd expect the wealthiest people on earth to have the most freedom in choosing a partner. They have the least. A family with modest savings can survive a bad marriage, a divorce, a reckless spouse, a public embarrassment. A family with a century of accumulated fortune cannot. One wrong marriage in the wrong generation can unravel what took 4 lifetimes to build. So the people with every choice in the world end up with almost none in the one area that matters most. Keep that thought in your mind. It's going to explain almost everything that follows, including the ledger, and the reason nobody ever bothered to explain it to her face. A record nobody outside the family ever saw. In one of Europe's oldest banking dynasties, a private family record once tracked something you wouldn't expect a bank to care about: marriages going back generations, each one noted, evaluated, occasionally flagged, not for wealth, not for beauty, for risk. A name could be rejected not because of scandal, but because of pattern. A grandfather who gambled, an uncle who talked too freely to journalists, a branch of the family that had once quietly embarrassed everyone at a dinner. Nobody outside the family remembers, but everyone inside it does. The individuals standing in front of them might be brilliant, kind, devoted. It didn't matter. They weren't marrying a person, they were marrying a history. That single idea should stop you cold. In these families, that you don't inherit money first, you inherit a reputation. And reputations, once damaged, outlived the people who damaged them by generation. This same family, the one with the ledger, solved an even bigger problem this way, one that had nothing to do with romance at all. In the early 1800s, 5 brothers were sent from a single household to run banking operations in 5 different countries. On paper, that structure should have collapsed within 20 years. Distance breeds rivalry. Rivalry breaks empire. Instead, the family did something almost nobody expected. For the next several decades, the sons and grandchildren of those 5 brothers married each other, cousin to cousin, repeatedly, deliberately. To outsiders, it looked eccentric, even uncomfortable. Inside the family, it was the only solution to a problem more frightening than any market crash. How do you stop your own bloodline from destroying what it built? Marrying within a small, trusted circle wasn't about romantic preference. It was risk-contained, dressed up in a wedding gown. But if marrying strangers is genuinely that dangerous, history hands us a contradiction almost immediately, because some of the wealthiest families on earth did the exact opposite. They went looking for outsiders on purpose. And the story of why breaks the first rule completely. There's a modern version of this same instinct, and it doesn't involve a single dollar changing hand. In recent decades, family offices, the private firms that quietly manage a dynasty's fortune across generations, have started doing something that sounds almost absurd until you understand why. Running background checks on a son or daughter's serious partner before an engagement is even announced. Not because they distrust their own children, because they've watched it happen before in other families to people who never saw it coming. A partner with hidden debt, a partner with a pending lawsuit nobody mentioned on the second date, partner who, it turns out, had already spoken to a journalist years earlier about an entirely unrelated relationship. None of that makes headlines. It happens quietly, in conference rooms with lawyers instead of chaperones, and it ends the same way it would have ended 200 years ago, a match that simply never happened, explained to the family as a feeling that wasn't right, never as the audit it actually was. The tools changed. Ledgers became spreadsheets, and priests became attorneys, but the instinct underneath it never moved an inch. Every generation invents new language for the same old fear that someone, somewhere, is about to marry their way into a story they never earned and never fully understood. The trade nobody called a trade. At the end of the 1800s, America had a problem. Families with staggering new fortunes, railroads, oil, steel, had almost no social standing to match. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, aristocratic families held centuries of prestige and crumbling bank castles with leaking roof, titles nobody could afford to maintain. So a trade began. Newspapers of the era gave it a nickname, the Dollar Princesses. Dozens of American heiresses sailed to Europe and married into noble families, one after another, almost as if the pattern had been designed by someone. Cash flowed one direction, a title flowed the other. One of the most famous crossings brought a fortune large enough to restore an entire crumbling estate, in exchange for a name that made an American family suddenly permanently untouched in society pages that had ignored them for years. Another American mother decades earlier married into British aristocracy and would eventually raise a son who became one of the most consequential political figures of the 20th century. A reminder that these arrangements didn't just move money across an ocean, they moved bloodline, and sometimes quietly they moved history. Nobody called any of it a transaction. Everyone involved understood that it was, and that reveals the second hidden rule, the one that breaks the first rule completely. Money doesn't always marry money. Sometimes it marries what money can't buy on its own, two currencies, and neither one is cash. Status and wealth are not the same thing, and the families who understand that distinction are the ones who marry with real strategy. Money without status feels unstable, vulnerable to mockery, dismissed as new, temporary, embarrassing at the right dinner table. Status without money feels hollow in the opposite direction, impressive at a glance, empty the moment the bill arrives. So each side goes looking for what it lacks. That's not shallow. That's the oldest form of insurance in human history, just signed with vows instead of paperwork, sealed with a ceremony instead of a handshake. Think of it as two different companies merging. One brings the cap, the other brings the brand nobody can buy at any price, built over centuries of being seen a certain way by people who matter. Neither side would ever describe the wedding that way out loud, but strip away the flowers and the toasts, and that's precisely the deal being closed, witnessed by 200 guests who all came dressed as if they were simply there for a party. But if this is really just risk management, why does it feel so personal when it goes wrong? Why do these marriages get remembered generations later as tragic instead of merely unprofitable? Because underneath every calculated marriage sits one terror that has nothing to do with romance: dilution, the fear no fortune can insure against. Every outsider who marries into a fortune is a potential lead, someone who might spend where the family saves, someone who might raise children who don't understand why the silence exists, why certain rooms stay closed to guests, why some subjects never come up at dinner, even when everyone at the table knows exactly what. Old money doesn't want to be seen, new money wants to be noticed. That single difference explains almost everything confusing about how these families choose partners, including a decision that looks, on the surface, completely irrational. The one who broke every rule anyway. Every system built this carefully eventually meets someone willing to burn it down for love. And history's most famous example wore a crown while he did it. In the 1930s, Britain's king fell in love with an American divorcee, twice divorced fact, which alone was enough to violate nearly every unwritten rule the monarchy had spent centuries enforcing. She wasn't from the right family, she wasn't from the right country, she had a past the institution around him considered disqualifying on its own, long before anyone even discussed a wedding. He was told in every way an institution can tell someone something, without saying it outright, that the marriage could not happen while he remained on the throne, and within less than a year of becoming king, he abdicated, walked away from the most powerful ceremonial position in the world, choosing one woman over a crown that had been waiting for him since birth. It's remembered today as one of history's great romances. Inside the institution he left behind, it was remembered as exactly the disaster the unwritten rules were designed to prevent. The family survived it, the story survived it, but it took decades, careful public relations, and an entirely different marriage strategy in the next generation to fully repair what one man's decision nearly cost an entire dynasty. That's the real risk sitting underneath every arranged, filtered, carefully engineered courtship in wealthy families even today. Not that love might fail to appear, that it might appear too strongly in exactly the wrong direction and cost more than anyone was willing to pay. The heir who chose the quiet one. Picture two candidates standing at opposite ends of the same ballroom. One is dazzling, accomplished in her own right, photographed constantly, admired publicly, exactly the kind of match that would make headlines the following morning. The other is almost invisible by comparison. Educated, careful, rarely photographed, raised inside a family that has spent generations disappearing from public view on purpose, the way some animals evolve camouflage instead of claws. An old money family will choose the second one almost every time, not because she's less accomplished, because she already knows the one rule that can't be taught quickly: never say the wrong thing to the wrong person, at the wrong dinner, in front of the wrong reporter, pretending to be a friend of a friend. Discretion isn't a personality trait, family. It's survival equipment. The way a seatbelt isn't a personality trait, either you don't notice it until the moment it saves everything. A partner raised without it has to be trained for years, corrected quietly at dinner after dinner, with no guarantee the training ever fully sticks. A partner raised inside that same silence already speaks the language before the wedding invitations are even printed, before the first photograph is ever taken. That's not a love story on its own. That's an audition for trust. And most people watching from the outside never realize the audition happened at all. They just see the wedding photos and assume it was the performance that has to be real. Here's where it gets complicated though, because if marriage really is this cold and this calculated, why does it still look, from every angle available to the public, like love? Because a marriage announced as a merger doesn't survive contact with the next generation. Children raised inside a house that quietly feels like a business deal grow up suspicious of everyone, including their own parent. The moment they're old enough to choose for themselves, they rebel, and the family loses exactly what it spent decades trying to protect. So the emotional performance can't be fake. It has to be genuine, at least in part, or the entire structure collapses within a single generation. The families who mastered this didn't choose between love and legacy, as as if they were opposite. They engineered situations where the only people their children were ever likely to fall in love with were the ones who already met every requirement on a list nobody ever wrote down on paper. Private schools chosen for reasons nobody says out loud at drop-off. Charity boards attended for years before anyone under 30 even understands why. Social clubs, summers spent in the same 3 towns on earth, year after year, until the same 40 families' children have simply run out of strangers to fall in love with. By the time 2 people from these worlds actually fall for each other, the pool was narrowed years before either of them noticed that they were even swimming in. It looks like romance. It's closer to a dating app with a filter nobody can see, built by people who, in some cases, died before the wedding they engineered ever happened. The experiment nobody staged on purpose. Now here's where the psychology gets genuinely uncomfortable, because it isn't confined to a handful of famous families with recognizable names. It's a pattern researchers have tracked across entire economy, in millions of households that never appear in a society page. For decades, sociologists have studied something called assortative mating, the tendency of people to pair off with partners who match their own income, education, and background. And the data shows something striking. This pattern hasn't faded in modern society. It has intensified year over year, decade over decade. As more women entered elite universities and high-paying professions, marriages between 2 high-earning partners became dramatically more common than they were a generation earlier. 2 successful incomes don't just add together like simple arithmetic. Combined with family wealth already in place, an inheritance, a trust, a family business waiting in the wings, they compound, creating households structurally different from ones built around a single high earner and a modest one. Read that twice, because it means something most people never stop to consider. Inequality between families isn't only created by how much any one person earns, it's created by who marries whom. Multiply that pattern across a single generation, then the next, then the one after that, and you get something that looks less like romance and more like inheritance, simply wearing a different outfit to the ceremony. That statistic alone should unsettle you, but it's still not the deepest layer. There's one more filter underneath it, and it's the one these families fear most of all: the spender, the one enemy money can't buy off. Wealth combining with wealth isn't even the final test. There's a quieter, more personal one running underneath every courtship, and it has nothing to do with a partner's bank balance. The spender, someone whose relationship with money is emotional instead of strategic, someone who sees wealth as something to enjoy rather than something to protect. The way a gardener and a florist look at the exact same flower completely differently. A single generation of a true spender at the head of a family fortune has been enough, in real documented cases, to unwind what took 100 years to build entire industrial fortunes, reduced within 2 generations to auctioned estates and forgotten names, simply because the money met someone who saw it as fuel instead of foundation. So long before any engagement is announced, an invisible screening process runs quietly underneath every courtship, disguised as ordinary conversation. Does this person tip generously to be kind, or extravagantly to be seen by the table next to them? Do they ask about the family business out of real interest, or performative charm designed to impress an audience of one? Can they sit quietly at a dinner where nobody is trying to impress anyone, or do they need the room's attention the moment they walk through the door? None of this sounds like love. All of it decides who gets chosen, and who quietly, politely, never receives a second invitation. There's a reason this fear runs so deep, and it isn't superstition. One of America's largest industrial fortune, built in a single lifetime around the turn of the 20th century, was carved up within 2 generations, not through a market crash, not through fraud, but through heirs who treated the family fortune the way a tourist treats a hotel room. Estates auctioned off piece by piece, businesses sold to cover lifestyles the original fortune was never designed to sustain forever. By the 3rd generation, a name that once appeared in every newspaper in the country belonged to people living on a fraction of what their grandparents built, not because anyone stole it from them, but because nobody screened for the one trait that mattered more than intelligence, charm, or even loyalty: restraint. That single word, restraint, is the real currency being evaluated at every old money engagement dinner, long before anyone raises a glass. There's an old proverb, versions of which show up independently across dozens of cultures, with no connection to each other: Chinese, Italian, Scottish, Japanese, and every version says roughly the same brutal thing: wealth rarely survives 3 generations. The 1st generation builds it, the 2nd maintains it, the 3rd, having never known scarcity, spends it. Researchers who study family wealth transfer have found the pattern holds disturbingly often in practice, regardless of country or era, which means the danger was never really about the money itself. It was about what happens to people who never had to earn it. Modern dynasties responded to that proverb the same way earlier ones responded to a bad marriage, with structure: family constitution, governance council, formal meetings where cousins who barely know each other vote on decisions that will outlive all of them. All of it exists for one reason: to do artificially what marriage screening used to do naturally, back when the pool of acceptable partners was small enough that everyone in it already understood the stakes without being told. Why the boring marriages outlast the dazzling. And once you see that filter clearly, an old mystery finally makes sense: why so many elite marriages, ones that look almost lifeless from the outside, quietly outlast the flashier, more passionate pairings that collapse collapse within a few headline-filled years, torn apart in tabloids that never understood what they were actually what. It was never about romantic intensity, it was about fluency in an unwritten code, the kind no language class can teach an adult after the fact. Two people raised inside the same silence don't need to explain themselves to each other. They already understand why certain topics stay off the table at Sunday dinner, why the household runs a particular way that would look strange to anyone else, why the public image can never be allowed to crack even in private, because privacy in these families is never fully guaranteed. Compatibility in this world was never really about chemistry. It was about whether two people were raised speaking the same unspoken language before they ever formally met. The way two people who grew up in the same small village share 1,000 references, neither of them has to explain out loud. That's why so many of these marriages, viewed from a distance, look almost disappointingly calm. No public fights, no dramatic reconciliation, just two people quietly running the same institution together for 50 years, which sounds unromantic right up until you realize how rare and how difficult 50 quiet years actually are. The experiment that embarrassed everyone who took it. Psychologists have run a version of this test for decades, and the results embarrass almost everyone who takes it because they contradict what people say they want out loud. Ask someone what matters most in a partner, and most will answer with kindness, humor, intelligence, the qualities that sound good at a dinner party. Then quietly track who they actually pursue, who they actually marry, who they actually introduce to their parents, and a different pattern appears almost every time. People overwhelmingly end up with partners who match their own social and economic position, closely enough that researchers can often predict the shape of a marriage just from the zip codes both partners grew up in. It isn't that people are lying about what they value, it's that comfort disguises itself as compatibility. Two people from similar worlds don't have to explain their references, their anxieties, their assumptions about what a normal Tuesday looks like. That ease gets mistaken again and again for chemistry, when really it's just familiarity wearing a nicer outfit. Old money families didn't need a research study to discover that. They discovered it generations earlier, the expensive way, and simply built an entire social architecture. The schools, the clubs, the summers in the same 3 towns around, guaranteeing that familiarity before their children ever got the chance to feel it as an accident. The dynasty that made this a science, centuries before anyone had a word for it. Long before banking families or American heiresses, European royal houses had already turned this into something closer to engineering than romance. For generations, ruling families across the continent intermarried so extensively that entire kingdoms were, quite literally, inherited through a bedroom instead of a battlefield. Marriage wasn't a celebration of two people falling in love. It was a treaty with a ring attached, negotiated by advisors, sealed by clergy, occasionally arranged while both parties were still children. It worked for a while, spectacularly. Territories that would have taken armies decades to conquer changed hands through a single wedding announcement. But it also revealed the darkest version, the risk these families still whisper about today. Marrying only within the same small circle, generation after generation, concentrated more than titles and land. It concentrated everything, including the fragile parts of a bloodline nobody wants to discuss at a wedding toast. And some of history's most famous royal houses became infamous not for their wealth, but for the price paid, quietly, over generations, for keeping that wealth entirely within the family. One European royal line intermarried so consistent, generation after generation, that a distinctive physical trait, an unmistakable jaw, visible in portrait after portrait for nearly 200 years, became so closely associated with the family that historians still refer to it by their name today. It wasn't a rumour. It was painted, framed, and hung on palace walls for centuries before anyone in power was willing to discuss why it kept appearing. That's the warning sitting underneath every modern old money marriage, even the ones that look perfectly ordinary from a distance. Marry too far outside the circle, and you risk everything the family stands for. Marry too far inside it, and you risk something even harder to fix. The entire psychology of who the rich marry is really just an attempt to walk a tightrope between those two disasters, one generation at a time, without ever admitting out loud that the rope exists, the last room in the mansion. Which finally brings us back to that ledger from the very beginning, the rejection nobody ever properly explained to the woman who lived it. Because underneath the money, underneath the status, underneath even the fear of dilution and the quiet arithmetic of two incomes merging into one household, sits the one thing every old family is actually protecting above all else: a story. The story of who they are, where they came from, what they stand for in rooms they will never personally be present, told by people who will never meet them for decades after they're gone. A fortune can be rebuilt in a single strong generation, the way a burned house can be rebuilt on the same foundation. A story once cracked publicly rarely repairs not fully, not ever again exactly the way it was before the crack appeared. That's why the vetting goes back further than anyone watching from outside would ever expect. Not snobbery, insurance. A family's story is worth more than its balance sheet, and one wrong marriage can rewrite it permanently, in a way no lawyer, no accountant, and no fortune on earth can undo once the ink dries and the story spreads. So the rich don't marry the rich simply because they run in the same circles at the same 3 parties every summer. And they don't marry the rich purely out of greed either, the way it's so often assumed by everyone watching from outside the gate. They marry carefully, sometimes for money, sometimes for status, sometimes purely for silence, because marriage in these families was never really about two people falling in love in a ballroom. It was always about which story gets to survive the century, and the families you've admired from a distance, the names that sound untouchable, the ones that feel like they'll simply exist forever, without effort. They're not still standing because of a fortune someone built once, decades or centuries ago. They're still standing because of every single marriage since, chosen by someone careful enough or cold enough never to leave it to chance. And somewhere right now, in a house you'll never be invited into, a version of that same ledger is still open, a name is being weighed, a history is being checked, a story is quietly deciding whether it wants to let someone new become part of it. No one at the dinner table call it that. They'll call it a feeling, they'll call it timing, they'll call it simply not right. But you'll know better now, and that's the part they were always counting on, that nobody outside the family would ever bother to look closely enough to figure it out.